Good news comes from the Middle East, bad news comes from Gavin Newsom, and the true news comes from George Washington. I'm Josiah Evertson, and this is The Glorious Rescue.
Aren't you tired of feeling forced to choose between staying informed and being indoctrinated? Listen to the condensed news cycle without the lies, agendas, and confusion from the mainstream media, all while engaging in deeper discussions about the principles that have influenced our great nation. This is what rescuing America looks like. This is The Glorious Rescue.
Lots to cover as always, mostly because it feels like our country's kind of on fire, and we're going to get to that. We're also going to explain why it's not so, why everything is okay, mention some good news to help keep us in that American spirit, but also because if you remember in our last episode, we did not go through the day-to-day news, so we have a little bit to catch up on, but I'm extremely excited about what we have planned out today, the stories here to cover, and then also our end of show segment as always. If you haven't checked out that episode 46, I highly recommend you do so. It was really a deep discussion entailing an interview of Mike Morell, California State Senator Mike Morell, asking me some questions, just some questions about principles, the principles that have defined our nation and the principles that will continue to rescue our nation. That is obviously what the show is all about. But first, we're going to hop into that day-to-day news, the cycle, the consolidated consumption that you can have of the news cycle here on The Glorious Rescue, as well as the deep discussions. So first of all, we're going to mention some good news in the Middle East, and that is Al-Qaeda. So what is this good news in the Middle East? I will explain it here, and that is according to a New York Times report. The quote-unquote second-in-command in Al-Qaeda was reportedly killed by Israeli assassins. And these Israeli assassins were on motorcycles at the request of the United States. And this is all according to, like I said, a New York Times report that was reported on by some intelligence officials. The second-in-command, Al-Qaeda's second-in-command, named Abdullah Ahmed Abdullah, also known as Abu Muhammad al-Mizri, was shot by motorcycle-riding Israeli assassins on the streets of Tehran 3 months ago. And you may be asking, why is it just being mentioned now? Why 3 months later? And that is because for several months, it was not confirmed. Many nations in the Middle East would not confirm it. Al-Qaeda would not confirm it and whatnot. But now we do know, according to intelligence officials, that this has happened, as well as al-Masri's daughter, Miriam, who's previously married to Osama bin Laden's son, Hamza. So this is not collateral damage, mind you. I want to make that very clear. This is not just a lady, Miriam, who died on the side and was collateral damage. This was also one of the targets, also on the most wanted terrorist list. I should say, to be more exact, on the FBI's most wanted terrorist list was Abdullah Ahmed Abdullah. But this young lady was formerly married to Osama bin Laden's son, Hamza, also involved in the terrorist organization. So I want to make that clear. That is good news in the Middle East that I wanted to mention with all of you, so that as we move into these stories that are a little bit more negative, we remember that on the national scale, things are still going well, and America still has that strong presence on the foreign nations map, per se. Next is a little bit about the election. I'm not going to go too far in depth into the election. If you remember about 2 episodes ago, which you can check out on YouTube on all the main popular podcast playing platforms, you can find more so about the election, all those details there, what the litigation is, how it's going about and whatnot. And it's a lot of more of the same as it kind of has been, but there are more reports coming out, more litigations, things like that, more states, and possibly more definitely more voter irregularities, possibly more voter fraud that we can and will get to in more episodes as more comes out, specifically in regards to the Dominion voting system. Very flawed system, a flawed system that was named flawed by even Elizabeth Warren last year. Even Elizabeth Warren in 2019 last year said that the system had issues and could flip votes, just completely switch the votes. So yes, a very problematic system. But on the other note is the idea of Joe Biden, his campaign, his policies, his administration, and the hypocrisy of the left. Because I want to mention this because it's very pertinent, and it's the actual problem of what we're seeing in our day-to-day. It's not the on-the-surface issues that we think of. Yes, there are many on-the-surface issues, but it's that deeper issue, those deeper principle issues that the left continues to promote that are really risky and are very, very harmful to the foundation of our nation. So, Michael Moore gave a letter, an open letter via social media to Joe Biden, basically congratulating him on the win. And towards the end, he makes the statement, don't let this happen to you. The idea of compromising with the right. Because, even though they like to tout the unity message now that they supposedly won and possibly won, we'll get into that in later episodes. But he says, don't let that happen to you, that compromising. They like to now tout that unity message. that we all know they were not about for the past 4 years. He says, charge in on January 20th, like FDR on steroids. Oof, like FDR wasn't bad enough. On steroids, you have no choice. People are dying. You need to sign executive orders and cajole, demand, and shame Congress into action. He wrote, and go big. Eliminate the Electoral College through the National Popular Vote Act. Done. Ratify the Equal Rights Amendment for women. Just one more state needed. Done. Send in the Army Corps of Engineers to Flint to replace the poison water pipes. Done. This is the mentality of many of the radical lefts. AOC, Nancy Pelosi, not so much, right? They're more of the establishment left. Yes, going much more radically left than they have been in our history. But there's another segment of radical leftists that Michael Moore is a part of. And it is this group that is fundamentally more dangerous to our American system because they state that the system is entirely racist, that the system is entirely wrong, and it is systemically evil and it must be repealed, replaced, and in that replacement must arise a new order that is socialist, a new order that would be communist if needed to be, meaning socialism by force, a new order that threatens the liberties that we hold so dear. That is what this group is promoting, that we obviously must, as patriots, must fight back against. That is what is so dangerous about that entire plan. First and foremost, about the idea of abolishing the Electoral College, which we've talked about on the show, but completely removing the system. Give points about the system. Why is the system wrong? Let's address it rather than just throwing out the system. A system that we're going to talk about was put in place by many, many wise men, the founders, including George Washington, which will be a big part of our end of show segment. But I just wanted to give you this brief note about the election, and that is in the very first debate, Biden made the statement that he will wait until independently certified results come in to declare his victory. He made this statement in the very first debate, and I love to see this. He was asked, will you wait until the election results are independently certified before declaring victory? And he simply answered yes. I'll give you the exact quote by Chris Wallace. Vice President Biden, final question for you. Will you urge your supporters to stay calm while the vote is counted? Mind you, the vote is still being counted. None of the states have certified the vote yet. And will you pledge not to declare victory until the election is independently certified? Yes. And here's the deal. We count the ballots, as you pointed out. And here's the part that I love. He says some of these ballots in some states can't even be opened until election day. And if there's thousands of ballots, it's going to take time to do it. And by the way, our military, they've been voting by ballot since the end of the Civil War in effect. And that's what's going to happen. Why is it for them somehow not fraudulent? It's the same process. It's honest. He goes on to justify it because he wants to give that idea that there's absolutely no election fraud, even though the entire 2016 was completely rigged and taken over by foreign governments. It's completely safe. I promise it's completely safe now. Donald Trump fixed it. I think that's what he's trying to say. Nevertheless, he says that he will wait, but we know he hasn't. Another idea and another update on the election are the thousands, literally hundreds of thousands of pro-Trump demonstrators in Washington, D.C. Mind you, Donald Trump did not win Washington, D.C. He pitifully lost it. All Republicans pitifully lose Washington, D.C. because it's the seat of our government. And the seat of our government, and our government is very corrupt and very left and very radical. So he didn't win it. So where are these hundreds of thousands of people coming in? They're driving in. They are flying in. Hundreds of thousands of people literally flying in to show support of Donald Trump, to show angst, to show concern, and to show the idea that the election is possibly fraudulent. And in this, some leftists, specifically, it has been confirmed, I don't know why we're surprised, Black Lives Matter and Antifa rioters coming in, causing injury to this perfectly calm and perfectly safe protest from the MAGA group. So you have MAGA, you have Donald Trump rallies coming in Washington, D.C. protests that are completely peaceful, that businesses are not boarding up their walls and their doors and their windows. And then Antifa and BLM come in and not instigate them, not rile them up, but just actually hurt them. That's what we're seeing. So yes, of course, we know that the right is the party of rioting and looting and harm and violence. Definitely not the left, which, even though that is the party that has protected, has praised, and has not called out protests on their side that have been systemically violent for months. Okay, and the very last story that I want to get into is the one that very much boils my blood, the one that very much frustrates me because it is hypocritical, it is elitist, it is tyrannical. And that is the bad news coming from Gavin Newsom. I want to make this very clear. A few days ago, he was found breaking his own rules. He was found in a group celebrating a party in an indoor facility, I believe it was. I think their seating was outdoor, but still they were in a group of over 12 with multiple households, definitely against what Gavin Newsom has stated. And I want to make this very clear. Gavin Newsom, like we mentioned in one of our previous episodes, is in litigation, did lose litigation in regards to abuse of power. And yet, I'm going to explain it in just a second. He is continuing to abuse that power. So how that plays into, I'm still currently working on sifting through and am trying to actually get a guest to interview here on the show with us, trying to figure that out with the whole video platform and all of that. Nevertheless, Gavin Newsom is laying out these new mandates that I'm going to talk about in just a second. But here he is breaking the ones that are already in place. And he basically completely violated the state guidelines, the state mandates. And many people have reported on this properly and in their own right, because I cannot get over this. The elitism to think that you can hold your people to a higher standard than you hold yourself. It's abominable. It's ridiculous. It's tyrannical to think that these people, what that does is it portrays the mentality that you have. It shows us what you are really thinking, that you believe you are above us like a king and we are your subjects, that you can mandate certain items for us and hold yourself to a different standard because you are above the law. This is not the rule of law. This is the rule of Gavin Newsom. This is the rule of Nancy Pelosi. This is the rule of Cuomo, who all three of those have done the exact same thing. The elitism, the tyranny is ridiculous. It's frustrating, and it goes against the very fiber of our nation. It's all about control. It's all about control. So he was found doing this against his own mandates. And then today, in effect today, as of the day of the airing of this episode, his new mandates roll out, where he has his own little dumb color scale, like purple, red, and green, blue, the little Skittle range. And according to whatever Skittle he pulls out of his candy, that is what we're stuck with for the lockdowns for the next 2 months. We now have moved multiple counties, like dozens of counties, into the purple zone, locking everything back down. Purple is the worst, apparently. And so now we are all locked back down in California. Multiple counties, I should say. I want to say 40-something counties. It's all about control. Because remember, if he were at least honest, if he were at least not hypocritical, and he were to say this aggressively, emphatically, and he were to adhere to it himself, I would give him the benefit of the doubt. I would say that he truly believes this. Maybe he's misinformed, or maybe he has information that we don't have because he's zealous, he's aggressive, but he holds to that same standard himself, and he truly believes it, and it's not back and forth, and it's not hearsay and doublespeak. This is what he actually believes. But it is about control, because he doesn't even hold the standard for himself. He doesn't hold the standard for himself, and he's yet so aggressive and emphatic about it, same with Nancy Pelosi and Cuomo and all them, and yet they don't hold it themselves. This is how we know it is about control. 100% about control. This is where I make the statement that the pathway to our liberties is paved by the blood of patriots. Patriots who have sacrificed their lives. Patriots who have sacrificed their fortunes. Patriots who have sacrificed their sacred honor to pass on the torch of liberty to us. A torch of liberty, that same torch of liberty, is the torch that we must guard with eternal vigilance. It is that same torch that we must pass on to our children and our children's children so that they can enjoy the same liberties that we have held so dear for generations. And it is that same torch, that same burning lamp that tyrants and elitists like Gavin Newsom and Nancy Pelosi seek to snuff out. They seek to snuff it out, but what does that look like? Well, I will tell you. It looks like our children, the generations to come, chained in darkness for centuries in the pits of despotism. That is what it is. If that is what you seek, then you can be under that same guise, that same assumption that Gavin Newsom is doing what he actually thinks is right, rather than him trying to control his subjects and who he believes his subjects. That is why I tell you all here, as listeners, as viewers, this simple reminder that if our republic is to remain, then as the unrelenting waves of tyranny grow stronger, the resolve and strength of patriots must grow stronger than that. As that tyranny continues to grow strong, may the patriots grow stronger, because it is so needed. Patriots like George Washington, who we will get into for our very next end of show segment of Teach the Speech. Welcome back to another segment of Teach the Speech. I want to make this a very brief segment, just talking about George Washington and his very first inaugural address, and his address to Congress and really to the American people on April 30th, 1789. This will be very brief. We're just going to mention a few excerpts. It's only like a 2-page, 3-page speech, a very short speech. You could probably read in several minutes, but we don't have time to get into it. What we're going to do is just mention some of the highlights and how they apply to us today, as a lot of these Teach the Speech segments are. And I want to start off by talking about what Larry Arnn said, Dr. Larry Arnn of President Hillsdale College, and he gives a good summary of George Washington. He says he was a very brave man, and yet a very patient, and more importantly, a very reserved man. A man who, if we really think about it, as the general, beat the largest empire of that day, the British Empire. As an army, they were not resourced, they were not backed, and they were not very large in numbers. And they beat the largest empire in history up until that point. And he did that. And he could have marched himself all the way through that empire and taken the White House and established himself as king. And the American people would have loved it. They would have praised it. And probably we would look back through history and we would be a monarchy, and we would be grateful and look to George Washington as the greatest ruling monarch of the United States. But that is not what he did. I want all of us to take note of that. George Washington was not that type of man. He was definitely not like Gavin Newsom seeking more control. He beat, with such a small army, the largest empire. He overtook it. He gave America its independence and then went back home to his farm. That's who George Washington was. And then when he was called back to serve as president, he served only 2 terms, wasn't held by any law, and then went back home to his farm. That's who George Washington was. And in his very first time being called back, he gives this very first inaugural address that I just want to mention. And he starts off by talking about how he was filled with great anxieties. He was very worried and nervous about this new office that he was taking up as president of the United States. And he says, on one hand, he was summoned by a country, and I love this, whose voice I can never hear, but with veneration and love. He had that call from his country. He was a patriot, a true patriot who had that call that he needed to answer. And he always heard that call with love and veneration. But then he said, on the other hand, the magnitude and the difficulty of the trust of what was entrusted to him gave him great concern. And then he says, in this conflict of emotions, all I dare aver is that it has been my faithful study to collect my duty from a just appreciation of every circumstance by which it might be affected. Basically saying he will arise to his duty in this conflict of emotions, in this struggle. He stood up to the challenge, and he had that duty to his country. He says, such being the impressions under which I have, in obedience to the public summons, the American people, repair to the present station, it would be peculiarly improper to omit in this first official act my fervent supplications to that almighty being who rules over the universe, who presides in the councils of nation, and whose providential aids can supply every human defect, that his benediction may consecrate to the liberties and happiness of the people of the United States a government instituted by themselves for these essential purposes, and may enable every instrument employed in its administration to execute with success the functions allotted to his charge. Very long statement, very long sentence, just one sentence. But what he is doing is he's giving respect. He said the very first act as his president is to give a fervent supplication to that almighty being who gave them, through providence, this opportunity of liberty. He says, in tendering this homage to the great author of every public and private good, I assure myself that it expresses your sentiments, not less than my own, nor those of my fellow citizens at large less than either. Saying, I'm sure that this is the sentiment of the entire American people, a gratefulness to an almighty God who has given us this opportunity. No people can be bound to acknowledge and adore the invisible hand which conducts the affairs of men more than those of the United States. Every step by which they have advanced to the character of an independent nation seems to have been distinguished by some token of providential agency. Saying that every step we have taken to this moment of becoming a nation has been by providence, and everything has been orchestrated by the hand, an invisible hand, an almighty hand, the hand of God. I love this. He says, this is much later, in these honorable qualifications, I behold the surest pledges that is on one side no local prejudices or attachments, no separate views nor party animosities will misdirect the comprehensive and equal eye which ought to watch over this great assemblage of communities and interests. And then he goes on to explain it even more, but basically saying he will not allow partisanship, he will not allow public parties, he will not allow any political associations or affiliations to cause him to not do what is in the best of the public good. We could use much more of that in our nation today. I love this. Just a few more statements before wrapping it up. He says, he talks about how many different things, and then he sums up saying, since there is no truth more thoroughly established than that there exists in the economy and course of nature an indissoluble union between virtue and happiness. This is probably one of his most fundamental statements he's ever made. He's basically saying the most common known and common exampled and common evidence truths, like in the Declaration of Independence, self-evident truths, that in nature, throughout the entire universe, there is a strong union, an inseparable union between virtue and happiness. That is what the founders meant when they talked about the pursuit of happiness, the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Because the founders believed that you could not separate happiness from virtue, that to be happy was to live a virtuous life within the confines of morality, within the confines of the Word of God, and to live a good moral life. And when you do that, giving to others and doing what's right, you will live a life very happy. And so the pursuit of happiness means to have the ability to live in a free nation where you have the free opportunity to live a good moral life without restriction from government. Unfortunately, that is not allowed in our nation today. Our nation creates laws against doing that. The bake the cake situation, we could give illustrations for decades, but that individual was not allowed to do what was right without being discriminated against by the government. The baker, I should say, to make myself clear. And that is what they mean by the pursuit of happiness, because there's an indissoluble union between virtue and happiness. And lastly, he says, since God has given us this opportunity, this land of freedom, and this wonderful opportunity, he says, so his divine blessing may be equally conspicuous in the enlarged views, the temperate consultations, and the wise measures on which the success of this government must depend. He's saying that God has orchestrated this. God has blessed us to give this opportunity, and basically the entire remaining and the entire future, the success of our government rests upon those same blessings of God. I consider it a very large blessing. I consider it a huge opportunity to live in a nation where our very first president, in his very first inaugural address, in the very beginning and the very end, states that the reason we are here is because of the providence of God. And the place and the reason of why we will remain as a nation, the way we will be rescued, is again the providence of God. Because it is that by that providence of God that he allowed our nation to be founded upon the principles of self-government, the principles even of his word, and founded in the culture of Judeo-Christian values. We don't have time to get into it. If you want more of that, definitely check out our last episode, episode 46, available on all the audio platforms. Again, it is an audio exclusive interview. And don't forget to check us out every Tuesday and Friday, YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, all of the popular platforms. We will be back here on Friday with all the latest. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Josiah Everton, and this is The Glorious Rescue.